Since the beginning of this year, Action SA sought to package a series of webinars addressing various aspects of our 7 core values, principles, and a vision for a better South Africa. In February, our webinars focused on ethical leadership, where we invited various faith-based leaders from across the belief spectrum to unpack the topic. A very successful and informative endeavor. This month, we're focusing on social justice. Recent developments in our country have led us to this focus as we witnessed the mayhem of the last couple of weeks, where it became evident that the cracks in our dismal attempts at achieving social cohesion demonstrated just how easily the things that divide us can destabilize and end life as we have come to know it. South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. The post-democratic government has not only failed to address the painful legacy of our past, but it has in fact deepened inequality. Too many South Africans still live without access to quality education, healthcare, basic services, and quality housing. The suffering of the majority of our fellow citizens can and must not be accepted. We must urgently strive to remove the barriers to building an equitable and more just society. We must do so because a society as unequal as ours is simply unsustainable. We must demonstrate a concerted effort and commitment to addressing key challenges facing our society. One of those includes our income inequality is among the highest in the world, with Black, colored, and Indian South Africans at a significant disadvantage. Women are even more severely affected by high unemployment, poverty, and landlessness, not to mention increases in cases of gender-based violence. More acutely is the disadvantage and deprivation faced by people living with various forms of disability. Our social support systems tend not to empower vulnerable individuals, meaning that they are unable to become more self-sufficient. What we are facing is a society whose context is one that inevitably lends itself to high dependency on the state for basic means of sustenance. We must, in all our efforts, aim to reverse this situation and set our country's trajectory on a more prosperous path in all spheres of South African life. And to that end, tonight, we are discussing an issue that has often been used to continue to divide instead of bringing us together towards solutions that will serve to make for a better South Africa than the one we inherited at the end of apartheid: land. Our discussion will focus on land redress as it pertains to Black Africans, women, and land justice. We are honored to welcome our most esteemed guest, Ms. Bulelwa Mabasa, who is an expert on this subject. Without further ado, Bulelwa, let's talk land. Our questions have been solicited from various members of the public, and for the media who may be joining us this evening, high-resolution recordings of these proceedings will be made available. For anyone who is watching from home on YouTube or on Facebook, you may ask your questions using our chat function, and I will ask the questions for you. Some of the questions I have received from Twitter, and I will ask those questions towards the end of the session and after Ms. Bulelwa and I have had a fruitful conversation. Now let me hand over to Bulelwa Mabasa for her remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Ngobeni. I'm the one who's honored to have this opportunity to learn, to grow, to share ideas, but also to share my experiences broadly in the area of social justice, and having a background as an attorney, an admitted attorney that has been in practice for a little shorter than 20 years. The whole premise that has truly made me want to pursue law was because I understood law to be a useful tool to attain justice. And I'd be the first person to comment and say law and justice aren't necessarily the same things. You can have laws, but those laws do not and may not necessarily lead to justice. So the remark that I'd like to make, I think this evening, is that we dwell in a society, in a global world that is riddled with inequality, that is riddled with poverty, and that is riddled with exclusion, particularly of women. And this must be, I'd like to problematize the issue by pointing out that women are in the overwhelming majority of world populations. But women still sit in the periphery of rights in land, of access to land, of participation in land decisions, and that this is not unique to South Africa. But of course, in South Africa, we have a bigger obligation than most, as you pointed out in your remarks, that post the promulgation of our constitution in 1996, we stated values that would entail a society that we would like to see and that we would like to bequeath to the future generations. And this conversation becomes useful in pointing out and pausing in this moment and ask ourselves the questions: how far are we from those values and principles that underpin our aspirational document that is contained in the Bill of Rights, that is contained in the Constitution? So without further ado, I think the work that I have been involved with as a lawyer, as an attorney, has been in the areas around land reform, and which obviously culminated in my involvement in the Presidential Advisory Land Reform Panel, and also more recently in the publication Land in South Africa, Contested Meanings. So I'm hoping that this conversation will take us some step further into understanding where the challenges are and where opportunities exist for us to find solutions that are capable of implementation, but also that are also capable of being monitored and evaluated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's get into it. As I was preparing for this talk, I just realized just how mammoth the task is, right? And as I was going through the book, what I want to kick off with is the title of the book, Land in South Africa, Contested Meanings and Nation Formation. What was the concept? What was the idea? What did the book seek to address or to bring to light or to achieve for South Africans? Because the title itself lends itself to a particular understanding. But I want to get a sense from the authors and from you as an author of one of the chapters in the book, what was the main objective of the book?
So for me, I got a sense very early on as I was researching land reform, practically, representing landowners or communities or mines or mine workers. It became very clear to me that what we were seeing trickled down in newspaper headlines were sound bites. And those sound bites were usually alarmist. Those sound bites were informed by us and them. Those sound bites were used by political parties as political football, particularly pre-elections. So it was the thing that was spoken about that would be thrown in newspapers as a tool to divide. And I thought, and I've always held this view, that if anything, land justice should be a tool to unite our country, because it is not only a moral obligation, it is also a constitutional obligation. South Africa, when we formed our constitution, we made an agreement that land reform would be one of those objectives that needed to be implemented in our lifetime, I say. And so it became necessary then for me to think about land reform away from the panic, the sensationalization that happens in newspapers, and really drill down to, at its core, what influences it? Where does it come from? Where are we today? And what solutions are there for the future. So in my view, land reform is the thing that should be unifying us all. Land reform should be spoken and understood to be not the thing that says people should be, driven to the sea, and it shouldn't also be a thing where we want to maintain the status quo. So land reform for me is a courageous undertaking that requires urgency, that requires capable institutions, but I think most importantly, a subject that belongs to the people. You find that whenever we speak about land, we talk about experts, lawyers, professors, universities. And I think that this is a subject that should be that should bother and have space for each and every one of us to have a stake in, to agree on, and also to move forward in unison as a nation. So I think that was the underlying, I would like to say, not the sole objective, but certainly an objective that was the driving force, especially behind the title that says how do we look at land and land reform as a tool, as a very useful tool to ensure a more just future where all of us can have a stake.
That's very clear. I am going to be led also by the remarks that you're making over and above the ones that have been I've been probing. We speak about the sensationalization, the politicization of this idea of land and land reform that has been used as a ping pong ball by some of us in politics, to get what we want at the time of elections. Can you just take society into confidence with regards to Section 25? I love that this conversation isn't party political, right? So Section 25 of the Constitution, I think every South African at this point in time knows about, even if they have never read it, they know about Section 25 of the Constitution. Was it an ill-considered a portion of our Constitution, in your view, given the work that you have done? I mean, is everything that we're trying to achieve in land reform and in land justice covered by Section 25? Was it ill-conceived, in your view?
The first remark I'd like to make about Section 25 is that it's an anomaly. It's a standalone child in the Bill of Rights. Why do I say that? If you look at a Bill of Rights, and this is the section or chapter in our Constitution that tells us what our rights and what our obligations are. You look at the right to life. It's a positive statement. Everyone has a right to life. Everyone has access to healthcare. Everyone has access to housing. But when you come to Section 25, it is not phrased like the rest of the Bill of Rights that says everyone has a right to land, or everyone has a right to property, everyone has a right to land reform. And it is not a mistake that it is so. It starts off by saying, no one may be deprived of property unless by a law of general application. So it's phrased in the negative, if you like. And that is because it should give us a sense and an idea that when the Kempton Park negotiations were happening in the early 90s between the ANC and the National Party, this was a big bugbear. Because what we were faced with a political party that had vested interests in property rights, in land ownership. And you were having an incoming ANC cohort that also wanted to ensure that there could be land justice in the form of land reform. So Section 25 starts off with, interestingly, the idea that whoever owns property or land, that land cannot be taken away they can't be deprived of land without a law of general application. And then it speaks about just and equitable compensation, and then it gives us some kind of a formula or values that would determine the compensation. And then later on, the land reform provisions, you only find them later on in Section 25. So you almost had an attempt at a balancing act that says, on one hand, we're going to protect the then property holders by ensuring that that land cannot be taken away. And the tool that was going to be used to protect that was a law of general application. And that law, we can talk about it later, but that was supposed to be the Expropriation Act, or the expropriate. Now we've got an expropriation bill on one hand. Then on the other, we say the state must take reasonable legislative measures to ensure that there's restitution. Restitution says if you and I have predecessors or grandparents that have a land claim, we have the onus, the burden of proof to show where that land was, to show the historical evidence for that, to show and prove that the disposition that happened of our great-great-parents or our grandparents happened after 1913, that there was no financial compensation. So already, when you look at these two things, in my view, it was already an unequal footing to expect the ones that were dispossessed of land to bear the onus of proving their dispossession, bearing in mind that Black people couldn't own land, at the time. So where are the historical records to show that my grandfather was dispossessed of land? That's just one example. The second example is that the state is said to be needing to be taking legislative measures to ensure that there is an equitable redistribution of land. Okay, we know that the state has done less than what is adequate for redistribution. So that's another problem, number two. Number three,
what does
the Constitution,
without cutting in there?
Sure.
What does this mean? What does this the equitable and reasonable redistribution from a state perspective mean in the current context? Because I think that's where the confusion begins to lie. Yeah.
So remember, I said with restitution, you bear the onus of showing where your grandparents were dispossessed of land, have the evidence, the historical records. Yes, the commission is supposed to assist you. So there, you've got the onus of proving that. And it's very onerous. I've said it. I've written about it in the Presidential Advisory Land Reform panel. I think we touched on it in the book. Now, redistribution is different from restitution. Redistribution does not need you and I to prove anything. You and I just have to show that we are in need of land. But me and you talking about that we need land needs the state to have a policy in place, a white paper, a green paper, legislation that will say, how do I then go about saying that I need land? Who do we prefer? Do we prefer, is it a pro-poor policy? Do we prefer emerging business? So that angle, that does not need you and I to prove anything, but to show that we need land, is exactly where the state has fallen incredibly short. We do not have a redistribution act. We have a piece of legislation called the Provisional of Land Assistance Act of, I think it was 1993, if I'm not mistaken, or 96, but very inadequate. There's no transparency. And what the state has tended to do, they've tended to implement internal policies within the department that have not been tested by a parliament, so there's no legislation, or that are not paired with proper fiscal support. So the point that I'm making here is the need for land is a place, in my view, that can unlock land need. But we are nowhere from getting to that point unless we have a legislation that is clear, that shows us who must be the beneficiaries of land, where is land given, how do I go about applying for that land? So you can already, and Section 25 on its own is not going to be a place where we find all our solutions. I've already given you why restitution would very much fail, because how do you place an onus of proof? Redistribution will fail if you don't have a legislation, if you don't have clear guidelines as to who must benefit from land, and so forth. And the third element of it in Section 25 is the idea of tenure reform. So security of tenure. How do you make sure that people with precarious tenure, such as farm dwellers, labor tenants, occupiers, aren't arbitrarily evicted from land? And so you have all of these three pillars that are in the Constitution. And you also have a provision that says no one may be deprived of property. So other scholars have asked, so if you're going to say we're protecting property rights and we're protecting landowners, the land that is supposed to be given for land reform, whether it's land need or whether it's restitution or whether it's to stop people from being evicted, where is that land going to come from? So the very long answer to your very important question, I think, lies at the heart of the fact that Section 25 was a negotiated outcome. And sometimes when and it was a compromise position between two ideological and philosophical positions that came from the National Party that had power at the time and an incoming ANC that had the obligation to ensure that land reform happens. So you're quite correct. Is it perfect as it is? I don't think it is. As you are talking about it right now, we're talking about Section 25 going through Parliament for an amendment to ensure that it could be made explicit that land can be expropriated without compensation. Two schools of thought. One school of thought says, but the way that the Constitution is phrased doesn't stop the state from expropriating without compensation. Another school of thought, which is a school of thought that I belong to, says, but Section 25 is riddled with an understanding that with expropriation must come compensation. And let me pause here and maybe explain what is expropriation, where does it come from?
And also just touch on when it says expropriation must come with compensation, who must compensate?
Yeah, good question. So expropriation is a tool that is used by governments worldwide where they need land for a public purpose, whether that is a school, whether that is a hospital. The state is able to say, Lerato, we need your piece of property is for a public purpose, and you will then be compensated. So it's expropriation as a concept is inextricably linked with compensation. However, it doesn't have to be market value compensation, for example. It can be something a little bit less than that, right? In South Africa, we have even a particularly significant reason for expropriation beyond a public purpose. Our Constitution speaks about a public interest. And a public interest is a little bit different from a school or a hospital. A public interest in our Constitution is land reform. So in other words, the state can expropriate land for purposes of land reform to build a housing estates for those that are landless, for example. But because expropriation comes from these, Roman Dutch principles, it's tied with compensation. It's inextricably tied. This is where I differ with those who say, but the Constitution already allows for it. I mean, the Constitution, if you look at the factors that need to be taken into account, when you compensate, it contemplates a compensation of some sort. It contemplates market value as one of those. So you cannot undress the Constitution and say that that it can allow for zero compensation. That's my view. But as I said, the debate, scholarly and otherwise, around this is already giving you a picture of it's not obvious. It's not as certain. And that's why you've had so much deliberation around it. And as I said, that was not a mistake. That was a safe a safe balance that, in my view, was always going to result in where we are today. Because my view is that it doesn't, although it contemplates this law of general application, which is expropriation, it doesn't assist us all the way, where we can say, right, we can expropriate land without compensation if that expropriation contemplates that Lerato's grandparents' land will be given back to your, to you and so forth. And you ask, who must compensate? This is an important question. It sounds like it's not a question as basic as it seems, because this is a question that has occupied different philosophical positions, even amongst political parties. The one idea says, which state dispossessed people of land? Was it the apartheid state? Was it the democratic state? One position says, how can you expect a democratic state to be the very same state that must now compensate those that dispossess people of land? And with that line of argument results proposals that have been made by some to say we should nationalize land. Because when you nationalize land, you will issue people with licenses of use. So you do away with private property ownership on one hand. Others have said, well, have state custodianship, where, land is in the same way that we have minerals under state custodianship, where, you do away with property rights. But the current framing of a constitution and the basic values that we agreed on, or the authors of the constitution agreed on, was that we were going to heal the divisions of the past. We were going to aspire to a nation that is based on unity and not division. We were not going to be adversarial, and we're not going to be punishing those that were the instigators, for a lack of a better word. So the third view says, in a strict technical understanding and philosophical understanding of law, the previous apartheid state, or rather the democratic state, will inherit the wrongs and the rights of the previous state. So it is correct that it then continues to pay for land expropriation. So I've given you three philosophical ideas.
My mind is blown. Now I'm just thinking about Mom Magdalene, whose daughter or son maybe, YouTubing this, and they're watching it, and they're thinking, this is complicated. This sounds complicated. What do we do? You speak in the book about the idea of the dichotomous treatment of land and property. Is that where the complication comes? Because people can't seem to be able to separate the two and deal with them in their singular portions and understand them for what they are, and then bring them back together. Is that where we are? Because I found that to be problematic. And then I want to come back to the idea of state custodianship as it could relate to customary treatment or management of land, as you also deal with in the book. But let's deal with the one of the dichotomy first, and I'll come back to the other one.
So what I found over the years very interesting and alarming for me was the fact that although land is part of property, and property can become part of land, we have treated the two concepts as if they are one, when we talk about real estate, for example, when we talk about urban land, when we talk about, human settlements, even when we talk about housing, nobody associates that with land reform. And that's because in the way that even the 1996 policy documents of the ANC was drafted, which was the genesis of land reform, if you like, was that land reform was almost seen to be synonymous with rurality. It was seen as synonymous with agriculture and farming. And that raised very important issues for me, both in the presidential advisory panel and in the book, to say, hold on a minute. Looking at South Africa today, as opposed to where it was maybe in 1994, where do the majority of people reside? And the answer is people have followed economic hubs of opportunity. And that's where that's in the urban areas. That's where I think between 65 and 75% of our population rests. But when we talk about land reform and what government does when it thinks it's reforming land, it's focusing on agriculture, it's focusing on farming, it's focusing on the former TBVC states. And so what then happens is that it becomes counterintuitive, because you have created land reform as a standalone thing that happens in those former TBVC states, where if you provide people with cattle and a little bit of land, you think you've reformed land. But land reform has to be repositioned and be made to be fit for purpose for the reality of where we sit. And that is, how do we reform spatial patterns in South Africa? How do we reform our spaces that we live in? How do we reform suburbia? What do we do with the gaps between the former townships and so forth? But you don't find that conversation happening within the lens of land reform. That conversation happens separately. It's almost like that's a housing issue, or that's a Cocta urban issue. So where I go to in my book is to say, you need to start repositioning land reform as reforming spaces, places, economic hubs of where we are today for the benefit of all. So you're not going to achieve land reform by focusing on, only focusing on giving seeds to people in the rural areas. And yes, I understand agriculture is a very important aspect of development in a country. Its contribution to GDP and all of that cannot be understated. But where is the world going? The world is going, agriculture happens in urban spaces. Agriculture happens vertically. It does not necessarily shouldn't be only looked at as a resource that only requires land. So what do we do with density? What do we do with urban density? Why is it that when municipalities start new housing projects, they are in the outskirts? They are still, the majority of Black people are still, if you think about the new housing developments that are happening, they are happening far from transport nodes, they're happening far from economic opportunities. So you're almost perpetuating the apartheid spatial planning, because you have not found true solutions to reform land in its true context, both in the urban and rural settings.
I mean, you say it beautifully in the book, just for those who may be like me and may need it in just a succinct, crisp language that's easy to understand. Here's what you say in the book. You say, government has unwittingly perpetuated legislating for the advancement of the Black rural poor population, while largely ignoring dispossessed Black urban poor population. And so when I read that, I started to imagine that actually you're right. It's counterintuitive, right? Those of us who have cars don't necessarily need them because there's a mall and a shopping center across the road and I can walk there. Those of us who work in particular parts of, it doesn't even matter. As long as you've got a car, you can drive there. But those who need taxis need 3, 4, 5 taxis to get to where they're going. We have a lot of work to do. That is very clear as I read your book here. Here's the one thing that you touched on now. You touched on the idea that food production also happens vertically. And as I was going through it, there's been comments around the fact that, why are we still talking about land? We're in the 4IR now. Nobody needs land anymore. What do you have to say to those people who are trying maybe perhaps to dismiss or not deal with the land question? Because as you and I have been discussing, it's a complicated question, right? It's emotive and it's complicated. It's definitely very complex. For us to unbundle it, it's going to take some serious courage. So what do you say to those who are trying to now marry the land issue with the 4IR that we currently? Does it feel like we're chasing waterfalls each time?
No, I think here's the starting point. When people say we need land, and in the work that I've done in the research and the public consultations, I've come to understand that land has become metaphorical. When people say we are hungry and we need land, that's a metaphor for I need to have a stake of belonging in this country. It's people saying, recognize my heritage, recognize why land is important to me. Land is important to me because it's linked with my ability to access water. Land is important to me because it's a place where I am able to exercise my cultural and my spiritual rights. I need land because land is in a way a place where our children's umbilical cords go under. It is also a place where we bury our ancestors. So it's a linkage between those that have been and those that are still coming.
So it's a source of an identity.
Yes,
and
it's identity, but it's also a source of livelihoods for those that do want it. And when I say livelihoods is if you are a budding entrepreneur and you live in Alex and you have an idea around creating a factory or whatever it might be, that livelihood is all still based on that ground that you're able to fulfill your dreams. So I don't think it's accurate to say we should, what do you do with land? The value of land is not just vacant land. The value of land is also your ability to do what you want above it and underneath it. That's why you have the mining industry that is thriving and that is a big contributor in our economy because land allows that to happen. That's why you still have agriculture as a thriving and contributor to the economy because land allows that. That's why you have people who would love to become farmers, but they can't because they don't have access to water and so forth. So you have to be able to unpack land in its multiple meanings. That's why the book is also called Contested Meanings. And you can see how various chapters go to the different contested meanings of it, that it is not singular, it is not linear. And unfortunately, even with 4IR, you cannot wish away or do away with the need for land and the multiple meanings that people attribute to it.
Let's lastly, before I go to the questions, because I've got a couple and I'm looking at the time. It's always amazing to me how quickly time flies when you're having fun on these complex topics that are of public interest. Let's talk about women and land now. In as far as we talk about land dispossession, land thirst on behalf of the previously dispossessed, largely Black Africans of South Africa, let's talk women. And land justice for women, in a nutshell.
When there've been studies that have been done where government has had different policies in place where land is given and support, for land is given. And time again, it's been found that women have been historically been the least, or rather the least recipients of land programs in our country.
Mm-hmm.
Although we have global tools like the UN programs and policies that on paper say we should be supporting women, you find that the institutions that are meant to be implementing the preferential treatment of women in land ownership are in themselves patriarchal. What do I mean by that? Even if you look at the traditional authorities, for example, in rural areas, there's anecdotal and factual evidence to show that women have been getting the raw end of the stick. We've had one of the latest court judgments as recently as 2020, where for the first time, our legislation was amended so that a woman can become recognized as a head of a household in the upgrading of land rights in the rural areas. It's only in 2020 that happened. Mam Sizani Ngobeni, the late, who was a phenomenal, impactful, inspirational figure who was raised in the UKZN area in KwaZulu-Natal. She was consistently denied access to land because she was no one's wife. She needed to, apply for land using either a brother or a son. And these practices are continuing. Despite having the legislative tools and the framework and what you have on paper, the underlying practices and the research has done, lots of academic institutions have done a lot of research, plus Institute have done a lot of research that shows that although women actually women constitute more than 50% of people who work the land, yet are not given the title, the tenure to stay on land. When we look at statistics around evictions, we have had more evictions that have happened post-democracy than before. And who are the people that are getting evicted in the main? Are women and children. So, and you and I know, we are mothers. We know that women have the ability to stretch not only a piece of ground, but a rand to literally feed the nation. And if we do not insist on the decision maker, the constitution and how these institutions are made up, whether that's a local councillor, whether that is a traditional authority, whether these are people that make decisions about where settlements happen as part of municipalities. If we don't have women that are making decisions at that crucial level for women, we are never going to see the changes. We've gone to the world and back, making sure that the legal instruments are there to make it happen. But the agency of ensuring that in leadership positions that matter, women make those decisions about women empowerment in land and women and decisions around land justice. And this is a creation of patriarchy in society. It's not unique to women in land. This is what we find consistently, from boardrooms to a farm to a commercial settlement. I think there's an upcoming textbook that I participated, and contributing a chapter with Wits University, where we look specifically into what do we have in terms of protecting women and land in terms of legal instruments, and what actually happens in practice, and why we find those gaps. And so yeah, I'm a big advocate of those that are making decisions, land decisions, whether that is where to put in a settlement, a housing settlement, or whether there should be access to land given to a woman in the rural areas, or even for water rights. Those, if you do not have an intentional strategy that can be monitored, that can be evaluated, and where there could be consequences for non-compliance, it's not going to happen by osmosis.
Well, that's very true. You and I know this very well. Now, let me go to Twitter. I've spoken enough. Let me give it to the audience. Jakes has 3 questions, or maybe 4. He's asking, in simple terms, he's bringing it back to the room. He says, in simple terms, what is social justice in your view, and how does this impact on the lives of citizens? That's question 1. And then he says, please provide examples of social justice. You see, we're speaking to ordinary South Africans who just want to know what is going on. The other one is, what are the biggest social justice issues facing South Africa? And lastly, how can South Africa improve this notion of social justice? People are watching and people are talking, South Africans are talking, and they want to know. So in simple terms, what is social justice, and how does this impact on the lives of citizens? What does this mean?
I would bring it down to 4 principles. The first principle is access. Does Gogo Dlamini have access to information? Give you an example that we can all relate with right now. We can now all register to, well, not all, but we can register to vaccinate. Is there universal access to that goal of vaccination? If we vaccinate people by them needing to have access to data, access to a mobile phone, access to airtime, and that sort of thing. So the first key thing is access. Do we have a population that is able to have access to public things? Do we have access to housing? Do we have access to transport? Do we have access to justice? Do we have access to the courts? Does everyone have access to legal representation that is capable and competent? So it's the idea of access. And we know with South Africa's levels of inequality, poverty, unemployment, that access is a big, big issue. So so that's the one big concept of access that I'd like to talk to. The second part of social justice, in my view, is about equity. Equity means having things being equal. Is there an equitable distribution to resources? And education is one of them. Healthcare is one of them. When we saw I'd hate to call them looting incidents. I think in describing them as just looting misses a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity in our society. That must tell us that if people begin to see the idea of taking things and disorder and lawlessness as an option, that must tell us something about how equitable our society is. So that's the second value that I'd like to attribute to social justice. The third one is participation. We are having this wonderful discussion on Twitter, through our laptops, in our studies. And lucky are those that are able to access this conversation through Twitter. But the overwhelming majority of our people and our country do not have an ability to participate, which we're talking about Section 25 of the Constitution and the fact that it's currently undergoing an amendment. It needs society to participate and say what they think it should look like, for example. That idea of participation, for me, has always been problematic. I'll give you something that always annoys me as a lawyer, is that if you want to see how laws are developing, you need to have access to government gazettes. But if I ask the man on the street, if I actually want to know, I want to know, how are laws progressing? How are laws made? How many people can say they have access and, access to government gazettes? How many people can say that before laws are made, I'm able to access a notice or a bill that I, as a South African, can participate in and make comments? So a third pillar of social justice is about participation. We need to create a society where we are not talking to ourselves and each other as those that have been able to access a level of privilege, right? So it's about participation. And fourthly, it's about human rights. It is about how does the state enforce its power to citizens. We've seen videos doing the rounds of grown men and women being made to crawl naked, of soldiers barging into shacks and structures, for people to prove that the mealie meal that they bought, that there's a receipt and all of that. So we've seen, I think it was in the hard lockdown last year, when a naked man was dragged out by police in the Western Cape because they said that he built an unlawful structure. So the fourth pillar is about human rights of social justice, in my view. How do we ensure that the state power is exercised rationally, with dignity, and with human rights in mind? So to me, those would be, I'm hoping, simple ways of explaining what we mean by social justice. And land, of course, is a big part of, if you do not achieve land justice, it would be a constitutional failure on our part, because it is a constitutional imperative. You said, what are the biggest social justice issues in South Africa? Definitely access to healthcare. We've seen that with the advent of COVID-19, how that has exposed the inequality, the duality in our country. I would put in education. Education is a huge part of a social justice imperative in our country. The ability to have a dignified existence. And that comes with an ability to be educated, have access to a job, or have access to opportunities, job opportunities, or even business opportunities. And that's where I think the crisis is. When you say, how can we improve? We need to lift the voices of people on the ground. Me and you, we make our own individual contributions in the spaces that we occupy. But I think more importantly, there's a lot of good work that has been done by academic institutions, by NGOs. But my feeling is that there is a level of lifting the voices of the people themselves. Because as we cherish our constitutional values and principles, as we say that our constitution is the best in the world, how have we drifted? To what extent have we drifted from the voices and the needs of the people on the ground? Because we can hold these constitutional values with pride and say, this is what we agreed on. But if we do not, if we miss what people on the ground are saying, because we are protecting these values and these principles, but they don't talk to the reality and the plight of South Africans themselves, then it becomes, it becomes counterintuitive. So I think unless we need to bring civic action back on the agenda, we need to empower our people. Our people's voices need to be heard and not to be spoken of and spoken about. I think that would, in my view, go a significant way into lifting. I mean, we've seen the Life Isitimeni inquiry happening, and there, I mean, with all the signs around us are telling us that we've drifted quite significantly from the wants and the needs of the people of our country.
I think you have captured all of it. I mean, it's just been such a, I want to ask you more questions. I won't, I'm looking at the time. I want to say this to you, fellow South Africans. You know, these are conversations we must have, and must have with a sober mind, beyond the rhetoric, beyond, you know, the hullabaloo, beyond the media frenzy, just as concerned South Africans who come together to say, how can we forge a future forward that is encompassing of all of our histories, all of our heritages, in ways that are bringing back or restoring dignity to those who have lost it, and elevating the dignity of those who currently have it, without, you know, tearing them down in the same moment. Because at the end of the day, we've got to find a way to coexist. I want to tell you, South Africa, before I close, that get your hands on this book. This book is titled, I don't know if you can see it. People can't see it. Oh my goodness. I hate this thing of ours. There we go. Okay, anyway, the book is titled Land in South Africa, Contested Meanings and Nation Formation. The project of social cohesion, nation building in our country has been aborted. It has been left behind, and nobody is responsible for bringing it together. There's been many, many attempts, but somehow it seems to fall by the wayside. I tell you that some of us want to bequeath a South Africa that is equitable, a South Africa that is just, a South Africa that is an option for future generations. We want our nation to work as we once felt. I remember, Bulelwa, I don't know where you were, but in 2005, I remember feeling absolutely energized about being a young South African who had options, who had dreams, who had aspirations, and I felt that I could achieve them and I could attain them. I tell you, in the current moment, we have a lot of young people, a lot of young talent who's walking around. And for the first time in my life, certainly, I have begun to see in many, many spaces of our country, faces of hopelessness. And it is incumbent upon you and I, who are able to sit at platforms like this. And I love the fact that you're saying that we must take it back to the roots, take it back to the ground, and bring and lift the rest of society up. Because the reality is, if some of us aren't free, then all of us aren't free. And with that said, I want to thank you so much for having been, first of all, for agreeing. I know you are absolutely and incredibly busy. And I want to thank you for the time that you've given to this conversation. You know, it's a tough conversation all of the time, but I'm so glad it has certainly opened my mind and broadened my perspectives around how we need to tackle this land issue. At the end of the day, after reading a lot of the excerpts in this book, I realized that there's a critical element that is missing. What is missing is courage, political courage, and political will. Because for me, I cannot see how we have not been able to achieve land justice for those who have been previously landless or deprived of land with the current instruments that we have. All it takes is human beings to have courage, make a decision, and make it happen. And so to the powers that be, and to the governments that be, and to the powers that shall be on notice, okay? Be on notice. These things are possible. We have enormous talent in our country. My name is Lerato Ngobeni. I even forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I am the National Spokesperson for Action SA. We are the conveners of these conversations. And please know, South Africa, with my parting shot to say, these conversations are not party political. They are conversations for enlightenment, for conversation, for discussion, all across the country so that all of us can build a more prosperous South Africa. Thank you so much, South Africa. Thank you for all of you who have joined us. Thank you, Bulelwa. I really appreciate your time. Good night.
I love the conversation. It just happened too quickly.
I know, it always does. Thank you so much. Good night.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for listening.
Awesome. Thank you.